I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's August 13th, and we have a lot to talk about. I think the longest year of my life was the year between my 15th and 16th birthdays, because turning 16 meant that I could get a driver's license, and that driver's license represented independence. I would no longer have to rely on family or friends to take me places. I was about to become the captain of my own ship on four wheels. I'm not sure that way of thinking ever changes, even as we change. And living with MS may require that you make some changes when it comes to driving. Occupational therapist and certified driver rehabilitation specialist Jenny Nordine joins me today to discuss how people with MS can maintain their driving independence while keeping themselves and others around them safe. But before we get to my conversation with Jenny, there are a few other things that you should know about. One of my favorite things about hosting this podcast is that it gives me the opportunity to meet remarkable people. People who, by doing what they do, become real difference makers in the MS community. One of those difference makers is Dr. Susan Sizer. Dr. Sizer is a professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University. She's been living with MS since 1993, and she's one of the founders of the Mobility AIDS Lending Library in Bloomington, Indiana. My original intention was to talk with Dr. Sizer about this unique Mobility AIDS Lending Library, and as you'll hear in a moment, we have that conversation. However, as we talked, our conversation evolved into a discussion about the stigma of disability. It was something I hadn't planned, but I'm incredibly grateful to have had that conversation with Dr. Sizer and now to be able to share it with you. In a moment, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Susan Sizer. One of the things I really enjoy about doing this podcast is that it gives me an opportunity to introduce you to people I call difference makers, and you're about to meet one. Dr. Susan Sizer was diagnosed with MS in 1993. She's a professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University, and she's the creator of and energy behind the Mobility AIDS Lending Library in Bloomington, Indiana. I met Dr. Sizer purely by chance, and when she told me about this Mobility Aid Lending Library, I instantly knew that I wanted to introduce her to the RealTalk MS listener community. And so, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Sizer.
Thank you, John. I'm so happy to be here.
I think the name gives a lot of it away, but can you tell me what the Mobility AIDS Lending Library is all about?
I would love to. First, I want to just say I'm not the creator. I'm one of four co-founders of the Mobility AIDS Lending Library. And we are all wheelchair users. And we realize that we have a lot of extra mobility aids that we're storing in our basements and garages. And we realized we need a place to circulate these things. They should not go to landfills. They should get used by people who need them. How can we do that? And we started thinking, well, we need a storage space. We need to be able to contact people. We need to be able to let people know that we have this stuff. Who should we contact? So it just started rolling. This stone collected no moss. We just realized there must be many people who have mobility aids that they are ready to donate. Either a loved one passed away, or they had a surgery and got some equipment and no longer need it. So we said, let's open this up to donations, and then let's let people know that we have stuff. So we were lucky enough to partner with the City of Bloomington, the Council on Community Accessibility. Many of us were already members of the council, and they partnered with us. They hooked us up with the Monroe County Public Library, And now we have the Monroe County Public Library stores, collects donations, and stores all of the manual devices. So canes, crutches, rollators, walkers. And we store and distribute all the power items, power wheelchairs and scooters, and lots of other medical devices people might need, like shower chairs and so forth. So it's a very active donation and redistribution site.
How long has this lending library been operating?
We opened in April 2022, but it's really this last year that word has gotten out. And we now deal, I would say, 5 to 7 distributions a week.
That is so great.
Yeah.
So what kind of feedback about the Mobility Aids Lending Library are you hearing from the community?
People are just so happy that we exist. And, like yesterday, I met with a business school student from India. His parents were visiting. His mom no longer walks well. She can borrow a wheelchair, a manual wheelchair that he can push from us for the week of her visit. And he just was like, thank you so much for existing. People encounter a lot of difficulty getting medical equipment they need from insurance companies if they have insurance. If they don't have insurance, of course, it's impossible. What's really great is to serve people like, I remember particularly one woman who she's unhoused and she's living in a tent and she lost ability to walk. We were able to give her an electric scooter that is allowing her to go out and get food. She literally could not leave her tent. So it's been really a wide range of people and so much gratitude. We're just now starting to think about how we can get volunteers going and interns going and all of that.
So when someone visits a lending library, finds a mobility aid that they can use, are there any costs that they're responsible for?
None at all. These items are free. Our mission really is to recycle, reuse, redistribute. All of these things should not go to waste. And we lend them to people for as long as they need. They can return them if they want or not. They can keep them. We just want to have people. I think I want to go into here a little bit what it's like to need a mobility aid. For some people, this is a really difficult transition. For other people, they're just so grateful. For me, making the move to mobility aids involved a real acceptance of where I was at, that can be really hard. I have MS, as you know, and, I didn't want to ever have to use anything, but I started with a cane. And then I went to a walker. Then I went to a manual chair. And then I went to a power chair. And every one of those steps was really emotionally difficult. But now, I think it was such a good move, each one, because I can now do the things that I want to do. So I can save my energy getting to the gym. And when I get to the gym, I can swim for an hour. I can go work out on weight machines for an hour. And so that's when I realized, I remember struggling from the parking lot in the downtown LA. There's a long walk from the parking lot in the downtown Y to the Y itself. And I was struggling with the walker. And by the time I got there, I was too exhausted to work out. So that's when I switched to a manual chair. Then I had to go and cry, to a therapist. Oh my God, I'm going to look like, I'm going to look so disabled. No one's going to talk to me. And I think that stigma around mobility aids is really difficult for people. And one of the things we do at Mall is we are available to both be a resource, to talk to people about, what they're going through, what they need, any of these issues that arise. And I think that's the really unusual thing, is that the four of us who started the Mall call ourselves the Wheelie Women. And we make ourselves available for consultation. Like, we have a public meeting once a month, but we also will meet with people whenever they call. We always meet with people to distribute the aids. If they're power aids, it's one of us. If they're more manual stuff like crutches or canes, they just go to the library and check it out. The library staff all opens the door and they pick whatever they want. But the ability for people to meet other women who are empowered by their mobility aids and can see, oh, this woman's really active. She's a professor. She's a lawyer. And she uses a chair. That breaks down so much stigma.
I'm so glad you brought up the whole issue of stigma associated with using mobility aids. It's real. I saw it firsthand as my wife went through sort of the similar evolution of mobility aids that you have gone through. And at each step of the way, she had the same experience you did. I remember getting her to transition from a walker to a wheelchair was especially difficult because, at least when you're using a walker, you're still standing upright.
That's right.
And your world, literally your worldview changes.
You are so right. It's so right now you're interviewing me and I'm standing. I'm using a standing wheelchair. I actually write at a standing desk, and I'm often standing. This is a ProMobile standard. There are several brands. This is great. But you're absolutely right. When I stand, I see everything, the whole environment differently. When you're low down to the ground, it's a different level view. And I want to talk a little more about that stigma you raised because, I also am involved in the MS Achievement Center at UCLA. And I'm one of the people who uses that service. And there are many people with MS there. Most of them still use walkers. And it's very hard for me to see people struggling. They'll contort their bodies to remain using a walker. And I see stigma. I see the absolute unwillingness to make that transition. And I get it. It's really hard, but to me, it's worth it. And I know for each person, it's their own, it's their own body and their own decision. But I wish that we could reduce the stigma. I'm all for universal design. I think that making the world more accessible to all kinds of wheeling would reduce the stigma significantly.
You're so right. And, when we talk about when you're standing versus when you're in a chair, how your view changes, I think it's also very important to point out that the people who are viewing you, well, their view changes quite a bit. And that's the other part of that stigma that makes someone feel shame when there is no shame.
You mean the way that people treat a person in a wheelchair?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I know that's something, actually, as an anthropologist, you have really delved into that whole subject.
That's exactly right. I teach about stigma. I look at stigma cross-culturally. I look at stigma in different issues. Like I study drama artists in India and the stigma they faced at being people who are on stage and in the public gaze, particularly women. And looking here, so that's a whole nother side. But yeah, I do study how it is that people who face stigma strategize different ways to deal with that. And I will recommend here one fantastic book. It's a 1973 study by Irving Goffman, a sociologist. And it's called Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. And in it, I mean, he's writing it in the late 50s, and he's working with veterans and amputees mostly, and other kinds. He brings in all kinds of study of all kinds of situations where people are stigmatized, whether they've been in jail, whether they are illiterate, whether they are blind, all kinds of issues where people face stigma, and how they manage these social relations, how they kind of make other people comfortable talking to them. So we do that a lot, us wheelchair users, the wheelie women, right? You crack a joke first. You say something self-deprecating before they do. You say, well, get out of my way or I'll break your door down or whatever. I mean, there's so many ways, but humor is a big one of them.
As you were relating that study that was done in the 1950s, I'm thinking to myself, there were very few aspects of our world that existed in the 50s that exist today. So much of life has truly evolved around us. And yet it's a shame that one of the artifacts of that era that we're still living with is the stigma you describe.
That's so true. It's sort of a final frontier, isn't it? We hope. Yeah. I mean, stigmas do change, and that's what we have to hope for. For example, the stigma on homosexuality and right. We've seen in our lifetime. Yes. Same-sex marriage is now legal. We're seeing it with legalization of marijuana.
True.
We're seeing it with, things do change. And we have to hope that this is going to be one of them. The disability rights movement is huge and making a real difference.
Which is very, very good to hear. As is this wonderful idea you and your posse have come up with, you wheelie women. The Mobility Aid Lending Library is such a simple and great idea. And what I love about it is it sounds like something that can be replicated in communities everywhere.
I think it can. And I think, even like I go back and forth between Bloomington, Indiana and Los Angeles, California. And when I'm in Los Angeles and I tell people about that we exist in Bloomington, they go, "Oh, I have a wheelchair. Will you take it back with you?" I'm like, "No, I will not take it back with you. You start your own mall." It should be replicated. I want to do a little plug for our website so you can learn about what we do and how we set it up. It's Mobility Aids Lending Library, all one word, all lowercase, .org. It's that simple. You'll see our bios and you'll see our mission statement and you'll see there'll be links to donate if you want. And to our swag, we have now t-shirts and caps. I'm wearing a t-shirt right now as I speak with you, John, that has a picture of a walker and a wheelchair and our logo.
Well, I'll be sure to include that link in today's show notes. Dr. Susan Sizer, thank you and your fellow wheelie women for not only coming up with a great idea, but for following through and making that idea a reality that can be life-changing for someone. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you so much, John. I'm so glad you're getting the word out.
Some MS symptoms can make it challenging to accomplish everyday tasks, and that can include driving a car. And that carries with it its own stigma. But vehicle modifications and accessibility options can keep many people with MS safely in the driver's seat. In a moment, my guest, Jenny Nordine, joins me to discuss safe driving when you're living with MS. Driving can be an important part of maintaining your independence. While MS can sometimes present challenges while you're behind the wheel, there are steps you can take to keep yourself and others safe. Jenny Nordine, an occupational therapist and certified driver rehabilitation specialist at Driving to Independence, is joining me today to explore how people with MS can safely maintain their driving independence through understanding vehicle modifications and accessibility options. Welcome to the podcast, Jenny.
Hey, thanks so much, John.
When I mentioned that you're an occupational therapist, I'm sure a few of our listeners wondered how an occupational therapist can help someone with MS when it comes to safe driving. And that's probably a good place to start our conversation.
Yeah, the vast majority of us are occupational therapists, and really it goes back to our education and the basis of our careers are related to activities of daily living, and driving certainly is one of the most important activities that we each participate in on a daily basis. So as a driving evaluator, that's really just my specialty within my profession to make sure that people continue to be safe and we adapt whatever vehicle that they might be driving with adaptive equipment or modifications to ensure their safe independence.
Can you tell us what takes place during a driving evaluation?
Absolutely. So a typical comprehensive driving evaluation takes place in two parts. The first half of it is done here in our office as a clinical assessment. And we're really going to begin to look at anything that someone's MS might be affecting with regard to driving. So we're going to look at cognition and vision and motor skills or sensory skills, as well as whatever mobility device that they might be using so that we can make sure that they're going to be a safe driver. The second half of that assessment takes place out in our vehicle, potentially with adaptive equipment that will make driving easier for them so that we can determine what sort of adaptive equipment they are going to need, if at all. Depending on where we are meeting somebody at their progression of MS, they may not need adaptive equipment, and so their on-road assessment will be actually out and driving. Then at the conclusion of all that, we come back together and make a recommendation with the client and any family member that might be with them.
So how does someone go about finding a qualified professional to perform this assessment?
Yes, our professional organization is called the Association for Driver Rehabilitation Specialists, and they can be found at aided.net. So it's A as in apple, D as in dog, E, and then D as in dog.net. And on that website, you will find a professional locator within somebody's region or state within the country and find a qualified evaluator.
Are there any documents that an individual should bring with them to that evaluation, or is there any sort of information that their healthcare provider should be submitting on their behalf?
Yeah, so our best practices as a professional require that we get a prescription from a medical professional. So that prescription simply needs to say something like a driving assessment or driving evaluation, something along those lines. So that will always be the first step. And then really from there, I would recommend that the individual speak to the evaluator that they're going to be seeing to determine what other other documentation that they might need within their own practice. So for instance, here in our office, we would require that they have a current and valid driver's license with them, a list of current medications, and then their eyeglasses as well, because we will be doing things here in the office as well as out on the road. So if they need glasses to see those things, we need that as well.
Are there options to help people who rely on a wheelchair or even a power chair to maintain their driving independence?
Absolutely. So we have wheelchair accessible vans and actually even an SUV that's available so that somebody can drive their power chair, if that's the case, right up into the vehicle itself. But beyond that, there are other types of equipment that might help somebody to get into the driver position of a vehicle or load and stow their manual wheelchair or power wheelchair with a sort of a crane style lift or a hitch mounted lift, or even in the back of an SUV or minivan to be able to safely transport those devices.
You know, MS can cause physical and cognitive changes. Are there any modifications that can help mitigate some of those cognitive symptoms?
Yeah, so the cognitive concerns that somebody might have could be mitigated through changes in routes, for instance, making more right-hand turns than ever left-hand turns. And if a left-hand turn is required, making sure that maybe it's at a green arrow, and so there's sort of less decision-making that needs to go on. But in addition to that, somebody might just limit their driving to a very familiar radius around their home, for instance. So if we talk about here in Arizona, where I practice, I'm able to put that restriction on somebody's driver's license. So they have a limited amount of distance from their home that they can drive safely. But to be honest, most of our errands and appointments tend to be within a few miles of our homes. So they can maintain their independence getting to the grocery store or getting to church or doing their banking, whatever it might be, but they have a limited radius that they're able to safely drive.
What should you do if a loved one is living with MS? You've seen their disease progress, and you're worried that maybe they shouldn't be on the road any longer.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really tough question or a topic to bring up to, for instance, a spouse or a parent even. So, you know, the first thing that I would talk about is somebody's safety and your concern with their safety out on the road, and try and give a few examples when you're at home and sort of in this sort of safe space, for instance. If they're resistant to completing a comprehensive driving evaluation with a professional, you might start to talk to their medical provider and ask if they can talk to the individual about how MS might be affecting their ability to drive and their safety themselves, of course, their passengers, and then others out on the road. Then there's other things that as a family member that you can do, especially if you're not living in that home. So beginning to teach somebody or show them how to use shared ride services, for instance. Of course, grocery and pharmacy delivery is more and more common these days. But focusing on their safety and your concern for their safety when out driving on the road.
When we talk about vehicle modifications, I think the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is driving a van. Does it always have to be a van?
It does not. They've done a nice job of identifying other vehicles. So the Chevy Traverse is modified with a lowered floor today. Braun Ability is the manufacturer of that vehicle. So minivans certainly, but also a nice SUV as well. And then of course there's other modifications that can be made potentially to an existing vehicle, as well as just non-modified vehicles. So we would have these aftermarket modifications. For instance, seats to help somebody get into their vehicle. These seats will rotate out of the vehicle and lower down so that somebody can sit on it, and then with a remote control, it powers up and rotates into the vehicle itself. or, an arm that will come out and pick up a manual wheelchair and bring it into kind of the middle area of a minivan, or even these crane style lifts that might put it into the bed of a pickup truck. So there are many options that your evaluator can help you with.
Modified vehicles tend to be expensive. Is there any financial assistance available to help someone who's living with MS?
There is. The MS Society has been really supportive of this. But in addition to that, if somebody is still out and employed, each state has a vocational rehab program, and vocational rehab, the agency is focused on making sure that people maintain their independence, maintain their ability to be employed. And so they may be able to assist with both the evaluation and the training, as well as the adaptive equipment. If somebody is a veteran, the VA system is helpful to them, and they can access those options. And then there's oftentimes churches or synagogues that will help with funding related to sort of their health mission, you might say. We also publish a list of funding resources that includes different foundations and community resources. So you might talk to the evaluator and identify if they have funding resources within your community.
Jenny Nordine, thank you for all you do to ensure that people with MS can live their best lives. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
My pleasure, John. Thanks so much.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/363. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes, and it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.